Oops, sorry. I think I'm turning up the volume in my notes. So, um, yeah, I think we're going to talk a little bit about indigenous cultures today and kind of their history in the South Platte River Basin. And I think it's a great way to kind of open up our discussion today. But, you know, I like to start off things with looking at a lot of maps. I think that really puts us in perspective of where we are, what the South Platte is, what feeds into it, where it goes. So, pop quiz: how many states are within the South Platte River Basin? Anyone? 3. Yes, that's correct. We've got Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. And this is my little diagram of where things go. So South Platte meets up with the North Platte, which feeds into the Platte in Nebraska. That feeds into the Missouri, which you can kind of see. I can't see I need a pointer. Feeds into the Missouri and then feeds into the Mississippi, eventually going to the Gulf of Mexico, which is the Pacific. This map, I love. You can see all of the different streams and tributaries flowing into the South Platte River. This is its watershed essentially. So just a huge amount of water flowing into the system. And for those with needing a little bit more background on what we're talking about here, this is a nice updated image from USGS of the hydrologic cycle. So this is just our continuous cycle of water on the earth and our atmosphere. Water is not destroyed or created ever. It's just an infinite cycle. And one very important thing that you'll see on this diagram is just the impact of humans on this water cycle. So we are deeply embedded in it and affect every single aspect of it. Water that we use either comes from surface water or groundwater. And the predominant source for Coloradans is surface water from snowmelt, rain or surface water from reservoirs that we release from the stored water. If we're talking about groundwater, we've got aquifer systems. There are 2 main types of groundwater aquifers. So alluvial aquifers are tied very closely to streams and rivers. So for example, if you start pumping groundwater right next to the South Platte River, you're going to start seeing some reductions in the river flows. Similarly, if you apply a bunch of water on the surface of the ground right next to the South Platte River, you're going to see that river go up and you're going to see flows increase. So that's an alluvial aquifer. Bedrock aquifers tend to be well below the ground surface. They're not well connected to streams. They're often non-renewable. 85% of our groundwater is used for irrigated agriculture in Colorado, and 60% of groundwater use is from non-renewable sources. I just saw an article come out today in the New York Times. I had a really cool graphic of the depletion of groundwater in the US. And it just shows, I think since like the 1940s, the depletion over time, and it is quite alarming. So yeah, that's just a little overview, get some concepts and basic things out of the way. If we're thinking about, going back to the South Platte again and our river basin, I love this map because it really shows you kind of the forested headwaters. So that green area is forest. We're up in the mountains. That's where you're getting all the snow melt, precipitation. It's coming down out of the mountains. You can see all of the main tributaries there. The Cache, Laputa, the Big Thompson, St. Vrain Creek, Boulder Creek, Clear Creek, all of the other ones coming up from the south, and some from the north and feeding into the South Platte. And I also love this because you can see how tied these major cities on the Front Range are to this river system. Denver, boom, right there, right at the confluence of a bunch of stuff. Greeley, Fort Collins, Boulder, and then you've got some smaller agricultural communities out in the east. But the South Platte River and its tributaries are just absolutely critical for both human settlement and agriculture as well. So just want to point out the yellow on this map. I don't know if you can see it very well, but that's agriculture that includes both irrigated and dry land. So it looks quite large. This map shows the basin, also shows the Republican Basin, which for some planning purposes in various documentations, the roundtables and the Colorado Water Plan, they kind of lump the South Platte and the Republican River Basin together. We're only going to talk about the South Platte in this class, but anyway, this map very clearly shows the irrigated agriculture in green along the river. So again, you can see just the close relationship between agriculture and the river. It's all along the river. The greatest concentration of agricultural lands is in the South Platte River Basin. It includes about 854,000 acres of irrigated land, and agricultural lands account for 85% of water diversions in the South Platte. So a very large amount of the water that we have in this basin is being diverted for agriculture. It is the highest producing basin in the state in terms of the value of agricultural products sold. So that water is being, it's having some economic value through the agriculture. And then when we get to the population, 70% of Colorado's population is located in this basin. And it has a projected growth rate of nearly twice the national average from now until 2050. So, we start to get a sense of the growing competition for water in this region between things like agriculture, municipalities, how do we have enough water for recreation and the environment as well? So this is just kind of an overview of what we're going to be covering in more detail in this class. So some of its water uses, and I'm going to kind of repeat some of what I said. Again, 85% of water diversions are for ag. Agricultural sales totaled $5.6 billion in 2017, and that's 75% of the statewide total for ag. 70% of the state's population is in the basin. That includes many of the most rapidly growing counties in the state. It also includes about 40% of the total statewide industrial water demand. And with the most latest Colorado Water Plan coming out, they're estimating in a scenario of hot growth, they say, an estimated supply gap of 540,700 acre feet annually to meet the municipal and industrial demand by 2050. So with growing populations along the Front Range, they're projecting a supply gap to meet the needs for water. And just one pause here, acre anybody know what an acre foot of water is or can explain what that concept is? Go ahead. Exactly. Yeah. And it's hard to wrap your head around it until you've just like dealt a lot with the numbers to get a sense of like what the volumes are. But you're exactly right. An acre foot is, if you had an acre of land and you filled it with 1 foot of water, that is 1 acre foot of water. So if we're talking, 540,700 acre feet of water, that's a pretty big amount of water. Water-related recreation in the South Platte River Basin is estimated at $8.9 billion. I was kind of amazed by that number. So, we're talking about skiing, kayaking, rafting, fishing, all of our water recreation, huge industry. Endangered Species Act also, we have agreements with Nebraska and I think Wyoming is included in this. We're gonna get some speakers later on in the course who are gonna talk specifically about this, but we have to improve and maintain habitat for piping plover, least tern, whooping crane, and pallid sturgeon. Those species are actually in Nebraska, but we have a requirement to provide water and do certain acts to maintain those populations, along with a whole bunch of other species and environment on the South Platte. So this is an image from the 2022 South Platte Basin Implementation Plan, just showing, yeah, go ahead. Yes. Yes, sorry. I will try not to use acronyms. Sometimes I forget, and M&I is municipal and industrial demand. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Feel free to interrupt at any time. I love to take questions during presentations. So, yeah. So this graph is from the South Platte Basin Implementation Plan in 2022, and essentially what they did, they have a baseline. This is like if we do nothing at all by 2050, what is the demand for water met and the gap that we have to meet that demand? And then they did a bunch of different scenarios: business as usual, weak economy, cooperative growth, adaptive innovation, and hot growth. And you can see that while the total bar kind of goes up and down, that gap actually stays pretty similar. So we're looking at a 25% gap in almost all scenarios. So just something to be aware of. And this is just a nice picture of all of our different uses in the South Platte. We've got all the species. Those are the endangered species in the Platte River Recovery Program. Agriculture, fishing, rapid growth everywhere on the Front Range, and of course kayaking on the Poudre, Denver, city water use. How did we get here? Yeah, go ahead. You bet. Is this for this year? Or is this for 2050? This is for 2050. So it's looking, I think the baseline is, okay, I'm not sure. So I thought the baseline was business as usual, but it looks like that is not the case. But yeah, it's looking forward for these different scenarios projecting to 2050. Yeah, go ahead. I think it's because the demand will change. Like if they have weak economic growth, the demand for water is going to be lower. And I think the projects and things that they're going to be implementing to get water supply is going to differ in these scenarios as well, due to changing economic conditions as well. So, yeah. Is this like referring to in 2050 accounting for climate's impact on the water supply, or account for climate change? I believe it does. These are really good questions, and I should know the answer to these, but I believe that it does take climate into account. I believe so. Yeah. If you read through the basin implementation, have like what 5 factors are most important in each of those scenarios, and they tell you like climate, like growth,
technological advancement, and then they're like different sliding scales of how much is incorporated into each of those categories.
Awesome. Yeah.
What's cooperative growth?
Cooperative growth. I think it's like smart growth. So it's like trying to grow more sustainably instead of, I think the hot growth is just kind of like going for it without much planning efforts around water. But again, I probably read the plan to make sure you look at those scenarios in depth. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so how did we get here? Good question. So again, I'm going to go back to starting with indigenous cultures and histories. Human presence in northern Colorado, there's a legacy of more than 13,000 years of indigenous peoples living and migrating through this region. And water was really the lifeblood, sustaining people for thousands of years. The reason why I want to start with this and why I'm talking about this, we can't talk about settlement and water development without also talking about indigenous cultures and impacts to those people. They're all very much intertwined and histories are related. So anyway, we have the presence of tribal groups as we know them today. So the Utes starting in kind of the mountainous regions, the Rocky Mountains, about 1000 AD. And then there were many different tribes that kind of lived and moved through the South Platte. The Arapaho, the Kiowa were in the plains, some in the foothills and the Rocky Mountains a bit. The Cheyenne, the Apache, Comanche, Lakota, Shoshone, and Pawnee peoples also kind of moved through the plains and using the regions for trading and gathering, ceremonial service or ceremonial gatherings and for food sources as well. Of course, then we have a history of violence, disease, and forced relocation. The arrival of white colonists in the early 1800s, there was bringing of cholera, a lot of disease, measles that wiped out large populations and tribes. There were also increasing conflicts as more white settlers came into the region, and there were attempts at different treaties. So treaties were made and broken usually. The 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty fixed the boundaries of the Arapaho lands from the Arkansas River in the south all the way up to the North Platte in the north, with the western boundary along the Continental Divide. So a huge region was for the Arapaho people. However, then there was the discovery of gold in 1858. And as you can imagine, that kind of changed things. So that was near Denver, especially. There was a lot of settlement and mining, increased conflict between miners and colonists and tribes. This image actually shows, I think it was Cheyenne people meeting with the Colorado governor and some of the military heads trying to get some peaceful resolution to some of the conflicts going on. It did not work. Shortly after that, there was the Sand Creek Massacre. So that was not in the basin itself, but involved a lot of the tribes that lived in the basin and kind of roamed through the basin. 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people were killed. It was mostly women, children, and the elderly. And again, this just, it is part of the history of Denver. It's part of the history of our state. And essentially it's really quite a stain on our history. Also, there was the forced relocation of tribes. So after the Sand Creek Massacre, there was a lot of retaliation, as you might imagine, on the part of tribal peoples, and then, relocation of people to different reservations. There are no reservations in the South Platte River Basin today, even though it was a region of great importance to especially the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. So to add insult to injury, the Arapaho people were essentially moved to what is now the Wind River Reservation. At the time, it was the Shoshone Reservation. The Shoshone are historic enemies with the Arapaho. It was going to be a temporary movement to just provide rations and things to the Arapaho, but it became a long-term settlement, went through a whole Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court said, actually, no, they shouldn't move the Arapaho here because it belongs to the Shoshone. And then they had to go do a land claim effort, which then half of the Wind River Reservation is now Shoshone and half is Arapaho. So it's a long and unfortunate history. I am very much skimming over it. Where did tribes of the South Platte River Basin get relocated to beyond the Wind River? I just wanted to show some images of people from today. So, it's not just a thing of the past. These are people that live today and have impacts on these people today, and how many tribal groups still continue to fight for access to water and water rights. So the Cheyenne and Arapaho people are part of some of the tribes in Oklahoma, the Wind River, and then up in Montana. Descendants of tribes. This is the Northeastern Plains. So this lists all of the different places where those folks have been relocated. I'm not going to read through all of them, but it's really just to highlight how scattered people are and the impacts on folks today. So the Southern Ute and the Ute Mountain Tribe are the only two Indian reservations in Colorado. They're located in the southern part of the state. And American Indian and Alaska Native community makes up about 2% of our population. So again, just kind of want to bring that history into the discussion and know that impacts to these people is very much part of the water discussion. We continue to leave Native people and tribal people out of water discussions today. I think there are efforts to improve that, but we've got a long way to go. So now looking at settlers coming into the region and kind of that side of things, water development. 1820, there was an expedition by Stephen Long. You may have heard of this. This was an expedition where he essentially called the South Platte River Basin a great American desert due to its dryness. He said it was a barren region unfit for the habitation of civilized man. So that kind of turned people off of, settling in the region for a while. There were fur trappers and trading posts along the tributaries. That's where we get the French Cache de la Poudre is French naming. And actually the Platte is French for flat, so flat river. 1859, there was the Colorado Gold Rush again, and a mining settlement along the South Platte in Denver. And that really started to bring in a lot more people. Then there was the Homestead Act in 1862. That act essentially gave land, 160 acres to anyone who would improve the land through agriculture. So it was encouraging people to move west and settle lands in the West. It also accelerated kind of this removal of Native peoples on the land, and kind of the violent dispossession as well is very much tied into that act, because there was just increasing conflict and settlers wanted to be protected from conflict. In 1860s, there was development of what was a set of laws called the Colorado Doctrine, a set of laws regarding water use and land ownership, and it essentially allowed people to divert water for irrigation, which was critical for settlement in the region since it was quite dry. And it was kind of the precursor to the doctrine of prior appropriation. 1870, we had the start of the Union Colony, which is what is now today Greeley. And it was a colony of agricultural development. A lot of the irrigation, construction of small and large scale irrigation ditches happened from 1860 to 1890. The Union colonists really had a lot to do with this and kind of changing that desert into habitable land. Moving along, 1876, Colorado became a state. They were the first state to adopt prior appropriation in their constitution. And I'll talk about that in just a second, the prior appropriation thing. 1880s, we start to see more storage structures constructed to capture spring runoff. So, if you think about our hydrology of Colorado rivers, especially where we're located here, you've got spring melt, snow melt coming off of the mountains. You've got spring storms. Rivers and streams are flowing hot, in the spring, kind of May, June months. That's when peak flows are. When you get into July and August, it starts to get a little low. And actually, the South Platte used to run dry for weeks, if not months, out of the year. So folks started to catch on that they needed some water storage to capture that runoff. They started making the first trans-mountain ditches to divert water for irrigation. So back in 1882, they were already bringing water over from the west slope to the east slope. That's how long that exists. So just going back to prior appropriations, this is kind of the rule of law in Western US. Eastern US follows a different set of guidelines. And Jennifer Gimbel, who is going to speak with us next week, she's going to get real deep into this and development of water law in the state. But just for today's purposes, all you need to know, it's the earliest uses of water have the highest priority for use. So if you staked your claim and were in Greeley back in 1865 and you irrigated some land back then, you've got a pretty senior priority right. If you are the city of Superior and you're trying to get water for new development and you don't have those old water rights, you're probably going to have some junior water rights. Just some examples. So another aspect of it is water must be used for beneficial purposes. So there's not supposed to be any waste or speculation. And this map just shows kind of the timing of when those priority dates are for water rights. So you get, those big tributaries coming out of the mountains. Those tend to have the earliest priority dates. So early 1860s, you've got this main stretch of the South Platte in the late 1860s, early 1870s. The red part is early 1800s, and then the black part is late 1800s to mid 1890s. All pretty darn senior water rights going back into the 1800s, but just kind of shows you how those priorities fit. And then just talking a little bit more about the water supply and where we live. And, if you look at this map, it shows the light blue area is kind of the low flows on these rivers. The dark blue area is kind of the high flows, the typical high flows, showing you just the magnitude of difference between low flow years and high flow years. As you can see, the west slope, it's got some very large arrows. On the eastern side of the state, there are some smaller arrows. And the east slope, although it has about 90% of the state's population, the west slope rivers carry about 80% of the state's precipitation. So there's a big imbalance there. Hence, a lot of these trans-basin diversions that we're going to look at in just a second. The amount of water that leaves on the west slope towards the Pacific is over 6 times the amount that goes to the east slope towards the Atlantic. The South Platte River Basin mean annual flow is 1.4 million acre feet. Again, compared to like the Colorado River, it completely dwarfs the South Platte. So while a very important, water resource for this region, it is not the only one. There are 44 structures in Colorado that divert water from one watershed to another. And the majority of them divert water from west of the divide to the east. The largest diversions are listed there for the South Platte. So some pretty significant amounts of water are coming over into the South Platte River Basin. And this this map just shows some of the storage. So as I mentioned before, when we're talking about the hydrology and the hydrograph of these rivers, we're getting a lot of spring runoff. We need to capture that to be able to use the water throughout the whole year. We're talking about irrigated agriculture. We need to especially use it for the whole growing season, which I think goes into October. And then for municipalities, of course, having a year-round water supply, very important. So you can see there are a lot of storage projects in the South Platte River Basin. These also store water from these transbasin diversions that I just mentioned. You may know this one. If you're new to Fort Collins, you might not know it, but this is Horsetooth Reservoir. This is part of the Colorado Big Thompson project, and Brad Wind, who will be presenting in a couple weeks from Northern Water, he'll talk about this more in detail, but this stores water from the Colorado River. It's part of a big project that was developed that included reservoirs, tunnels, pipes, and distribution system that's bringing water over from the Colorado River. And Fort Collins and much of the Front Range actually gets about 50% of its water supply from the Colorado River. So if you didn't know, now you know. Okay, but before Horsetooth and all of that, let's go back to a little bit more history. Return flow hydrology. This is very important for the South Platte River Basin. So back in 1922, CSU existed as the Colorado Agricultural College, and Ralph Parshall, who's kind of famous, he did a paper that essentially documented return flows coming in from irrigated agriculture. So when you're, again, applying land to the area and it's nearby the South Platte River, you're going to see that water infiltrate the water that's not being used by the plants. It's going right back into the river. And surface water irrigation was leading to the rise of the groundwater table in some areas as much as 100 feet. So historically, the South Platte would run dry in the summer months, but surface water irrigation was leading to more constant flows along the lower South Platte in summer months. And this was important also for, flows. If you think about flows coming into Nebraska, that was changing kind of the timing and the supply of those flows. However, then we had a lot of groundwater well development. So Dust Bowl in the 1930s hit hard with some drought. Rivers were going dry. And the response was, let's dig into that groundwater. So there was a ton of groundwater well development, alluvial groundwater well development. So this is all along the South Platte and its tributaries. This diagram shows, so the number of wells are the bars, and the cumulative number of wells is in the little line that you see there. So started in the 1930s. There was a big drought again in the 50s, and you see just these huge developments of wells in the mid 50s. And that really led to some issues on the South Platte. We've got this whole system of water rights. Surface water users all of a sudden started seeing their surface water. They may have priority rights to get that surface water, and all of a sudden it was disappearing because of a lot of this groundwater pumping. So in 1955, more than 4,000 irrigation wells pumped enough water to fill Horsetooth Reservoir 4 times. That was a lot of water, had major impacts on the river. They started passing all these laws to start to regulate groundwater pumping in the state and resolve some of those conflicts. I'm not going to go into detail on all of those laws, but now in the 1970s through today, we have augmentation plans that can be used for groundwater pumping. It can be used for junior. Essentially, if you have water that you're using that is a lower priority than someone else's water, you can augment it. You can replace that water, essentially. If you're talking about groundwater, it's tricky. So if you divert or operate out of priority, you can do it as long as you replace some water in the same time location, and amount to prevent injury to that other user. So we've got a complicated legal system that regulates both surface water and groundwater now in the state of Colorado. So just to summarize, and I'm almost done here, I want to leave some time for questions. Our average annual native flow. So this is all the flows that are not coming from out of basin. They're the South Platte River Basin, all the tributaries, 1.4 million acre feet. Transbasin water coming into the South Platte River Basin is equivalent to about 400,000 acre feet per year. Non-tributary groundwater aquifer. So this is water that is it's not in any basin, groundwater basin. So it's essentially water where the withdrawal is not going to deplete streams or flows, surface water flows. That's about 30,000 acre feet. But the total annual surface water diversions are 4 million acre feet, and groundwater withdrawals are 500,000 acre feet. So what does that tell you about this system? Water is being reused over and over and over again. You know, let's say City of Fort Collins is taking it out from the Pooter. They're using it for municipal supplies. They're probably reusing it. I don't even know how many times. Cities reuse water a lot. Some will get just discharged back into the river. Farmers taking that out to irrigate his lands. Some is going to the plant, but a lot of that's coming back down into the soil. That's continuing downstream. Someone else is pulling it out, and it just goes on and on and on all the way until you get to Nebraska. So that return flow aspect of the South Platte River Basin is very important. And it really, when we think about water efficiency in terms of agricultural application as well as city municipal use, it becomes kind of tricky because the water that's going back into the system from those return flows, that's someone else's water. So if you're becoming more efficient, it's a tricky business. So just to mention a few challenges, this is from the 2023 Colorado Water Plan, and I just pulled out a few of these. Significant amount of supply is coming from the Colorado River Basin, and that's subject to compact compliance. So the Colorado Big Thompson project, that is considered a junior, water right. So, if we get to continuing major drought on the Colorado River, that could impact water supply for the Front Range. Meeting future municipal, industrial, and ag water needs while protecting and enhancing environmental and recreational opportunities. So there's a trend, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, is this buy and dry. So as municipalities grow, they're essentially buying water from agricultural users, and that's really decreasing the amount of irrigated agriculture that we have in our state. That's impacting communities, the economy, and the environment in many different ways. And climate change impacts. So there's likely reduction of stream flows, shifting snowmelt runoff patterns, so the timing of those things, and then all of the variability that we're seeing just year to year now. And then again, as I mentioned, efficiency improvements, reuse, and watershed health projects involving recharge can reduce or change the timing of return flows that supply downstream water users of all sectors. And then lastly, there are water quality issues. As we reuse that water over and over again, it changes the quality of that water. There's salts, there's nutrients, there's all kinds of other pollutants in there. And so there are some water quality issues that have to be considered. So I'm going to stop there. That is kind of a broad overview of all of the different topics that we're going to get in more detail from other speakers over the course of this semester. And that was quick. I will take any questions and we can go back to slides if you have specific questions on slides, but I think we've got a couple minutes here for questions. So, yep. Go ahead.
I think a lot of my relative about this here, and we don't ever really talk about the Denver Basin aquifer. There's a lot of conversation about the pipelines aquifer and just kind of groundwater in general, but do you have any information, start or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so the Denver Basin Aquifer, you're talking about trying to think of the not, what's the term? It's like not non, oh my gosh, someone help me on this. Non-renewable groundwater.
Called not non-tributary.
Thank you, Jennifer. Not non-tributary. So yeah, there's been a whole complication of issues with groundwater in the Denver Basin. There is still quite a bit of use, but it has. I mean, there's been a lot of change in how people are thinking about the use in the region. I think they're trying to rein it in a bit. I don't have a lot of background information on that. I don't know if Jennifer or someone else, do you want to provide a little info?
Karen, I didn't quite hear the question, but it's a confined, those are confined aquifers. And you have counties like Douglas County and municipalities in southern Denver that are drawing off those or were drawing off those aquifers solely. And so they were reaching a crisis point in figuring out how they needed to expand their supplies from other sources. And I could go into more next week if you want.
So I don't know if you heard that. Jennifer said these are confined aquifers, and that means they're not being replenished by surface water. It's taking a very long time to replenish those groundwater supplies, and they're being drawn down at a very rapid rate, which was causing a lot of alarm. And I think they're thinking about new management strategies for that. She can go into more detail next week. Yeah. And with that, yeah. Yeah, there is a lot being done to think about ways to fill that gap a lot. So the Colorado Water Plan really lays out a bunch of different strategies to go about doing that. There's municipal water conservation, there's agricultural efficiency projects, there's development of new water projects, which, there's mixed reviews on that. Like, will it get us more water? Will it get us more supply? There's more storage projects coming down the pipeline. So there's a lot of different ways. And we will be talking about, we have an urban water conservation. So the city of Aurora is going to be speaking with us about a lot of their very progressive policies that they have in place for the city of Aurora. They essentially, any new development is not allowed to have non-functional turf grass. So if you're not using your turf for anything, you can't have it. And strategies to replace non-functional turf grass. So there's a lot of work, and a lot of programs that are addressing kind of the municipal water supply aspect. The buy and dry aspect is a little bit more complicated. A lot of, and this is not all farmers, many farmers want to stay in business. They want to keep the water, they want to keep it in production. There are strategies being developed where they're looking at some more temporary water kind of transfers from agriculture to municipality. So it's not a permanent buy and dry, but let's fallow some land or, plant it in a crop that's less water using for a couple years. And so, yeah, there's a lot going on, and I'm hoping, we will cover a lot of those in our class going forward. Yeah. More questions? Yeah.
What about renewable water? And to stay off a lot of the breweries, bigger ones that are taking water and removing it from the basin, the wells, the natural gas stuff, that are being capped, so that removing the water that's up in there where that's not a time until the water, well, breaks, which it will at some point. And that would also affect water quality because of the proprietary unknown substances that are in there. So, like what's being done to address those types of things that are not supposed to happen? You can't remove the water from it.
Yeah, I mean, all of the water uses that are occurring, they have permits, they have the water rights, they do have the right to use that water for consumptive use. I don't, I mean, if they have a legal water use, someone's going to take them to court and they're going to be stopped. So all of those uses that you're describing, you know, for example, use of water to make beer and then sell the beer in some other place across the United States. I mean, it's the same thing with agriculture. You're producing a lot of crops that are being shipped elsewhere. And that is totally legal thing to do. If you've got the water rights, you've got the permits to do it and things like that. I think one of the things that we'll be talking about over the course of this semester is the value of our water and how we're thinking about that value as a society. Like, does it make sense to ship alfalfa to different parts of the world? Or do we want to use that water and value it in a different way? And then, you know, putting in policy in place that would address some of those food concerns. It's a very complicated thing, but going back to your original question, those are all legal and carried out as according to law. So yeah, if it's not, people will take them to water court real quick. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. And oh, I've just got a message online that says, please repeat the questions that are asked. We can't hear them online. Sorry about that, people online. Hopefully you got the gist of them from my responses. But okay, if there are no more questions, we'll see you next week. And Jennifer Gimbel will be speaking about some of the water law and compacts in the South Platte River Basin. If you have any questions or want the syllabus, just come up and talk afterwards, and make sure you filled out the attendance sheet. Thank you. Thanks, everybody online.
Thank you.